this theme or story is not an unusual theme. Here we have one kind of precedent for it, Angra's Turkish bath. Here we have another precedent for Picasso, something that he very much had in mind as he was working on Les Demoiselles, Cézanne's Bathers. If we put Les Demoiselles alongside Cézanne's Large Bathers, we see immediately the visual affinities as well as the thematic affinities. Here we have some other sources that Picasso drew on. Up in the top left, of course, is El Greco. Notice how similar El Greco's treatment of the sky and the landscape, the green area in the middle ground, is to Picasso's handling of the space around Les Demoiselles. When it comes to Picasso admitting his source imagery taken from Africa or other primitive cultures, he wasn't as always forthcoming. In fact, he denied that these were influences, even though we know that he had both access to some of these items, and some of these items were in his possession at the time. So we know that he was looking at these images and artworks from other cultures. For instance, in March 1907, two Iberian statues were stolen from the Louvre. Picasso bought one of those, probably because they represented his cultural roots, and we see that two of the central figures in Les Demoiselles have faces very similar to Iberian statues. To make an even stronger case that Picasso was looking at other cultures and the artwork of other cultures, this photograph was found among his possessions, and it was something that he had at the time. Look especially at the woman on the lower right-hand quadrant holding the bowl, and compare it to the figure in the lower right-hand quadrant in Les Demoiselles. It's an exact quote from this photograph. So here we have an image that's using a space of inexhaustible contrast. It's against narrative and interpretation because it can't simply be about prostitutes. That had already been done. For instance, Angra's Turkish bath that we saw. It also can't be simply about prostitutes because these women have faces from different cultures. Distortion is involved. We have this idea of contorted space and unusual use of color. So if we try to say it is about syphilis, or if it's about desire, or it's about flouting convention, we can always point to something else that contradicts that interpretation. For instance, I haven't touched on the still life in the bottom, which has an unusually phallic form, nor have I talked about this strange combination of desire versus ugliness versus these women staring and confronting us aggressively. And yet it's compelling. Once we get over the shock or the unease or this feeling of not knowing what it's about, it's a compelling image. Picasso was very methodical and very thoughtful in completing it. Going back to the figure in the lower right quadrant, if we turn that spread-eagled form around, it wouldn't refer to or inflame desire as much, because there is something about not seeing yet knowing about the physical presence of that figure that is central to the constellation of meanings associated with that figure. Notice also there's no way of changing this image. We couldn't put this image, say, in a linear perspective space and have it mean the exact same thing. The use of space, the way the forms are conveyed, the technique, the compositional structure, the use of distortion, the cultural references, the jamming together of philosophical ideas, all exist in a unique way in this image, and changing any aspect of this image would be to change the whole thing. So the form this painting finally allowed Picasso, it gave Picasso a way to break from 2,000 years of naturalism and realistic representation. It's been much examined and written about. It's been x-rayed. We have proof he was using African masks and postcards from some of the x-rays that have been taken of this image. We know there are some personal biographical elements from his fear of syphilis in the early narrative version of this image, the storytelling that he finally got rid of, to the staring eyes. Remember, I talked about the Andalusian eyes, and here again we have the strong gaze, which seemed to be culturally very important to him. And he's imparted this strong gaze to these women who are not passive, who are not sensuous nudes in the tradition of Western art. There's nothing pleasing or calm about Les Demoiselles. In a way, he's critically re-examining the history of female representation, but from an aggressively very male perspective. Notice he seems to be kind of nervous about representing the women's genitalia. Nevertheless, in bringing all of these elements into some kind of tense alignment, he's finding a way to break with 2,000 years of naturalism, trying to find a new way of drawing everything. Notice the gaps between the figures take on a life of their own. The negative space is treated as if it's as physical and as present and as evocative as the positive space. It's the first picture to reject perspective and the idea that an artwork or a picture refers to reality or is a window on the world. But after hundreds and hundreds of years of attempting to represent space realistically, he's not rejecting it naively, and he's not rejecting it casually or not even accidentally. He's rejecting it with intellectual clarity and lucidity. In fact, I think we would be hard-pressed to find anything in the history of art that uses space like this image does in any similar way. It's not a hierarchical space like the Egyptians used, but it is a flatter space, and it rejects linear perspective. It's not a storytelling space, yet it's not an icon image like we might see in some religious art. It's not a purely decorative space. It's not, nor is it a space of pure abstraction. While we can point to source materials and people who inspired him, none of those sources use space in exactly the same way. So, sometimes we say there's nothing new under the sun, but every once in a while there does seem to be something new. It's a space he needed to invent to develop his own artistic voice, to establish his own artistic voice, and to meet the needs of his own artistic vision. Let's turn to some other artists who have their own particular and idiosyncratic use of space, and who have chosen or invented or developed a kind of space that meets or matches their expressive needs.